Hi, I'm Ted London, Director of the Base of the Pyramid Initiative at the William Davidson Institute at the University of Michigan. I'm here today with Stuart Hart, who's the Samuel Curtis Johnson Chair of Sustainable Global Enterprise and Professor of Management at Cornell University's Johnson School of Management. So thank you, Stu, for spending a little time talking today.
Pleasure to be here.
I'd like to ask you first, you're certainly recognized as a thought leader on sustainability and strategy, particularly from the business perspective. Kind of how has your thinking about these issues evolved over time?
Yeah, it's been an interesting evolution, I would say, from a starting point maybe 15 years ago or so to where we are now. And I think that's reflective of this term sustainability, which is ill-defined, fairly amorphous, kind of ambiguous, and can be, in some sense, a vessel that you choose to fill in any way that you want. For me, it's kind of been a pathway which started more on the environmental side, where I became very interested and concerned about issues of global environmental sustainability and its connection to business. That took me into what 15, 20 years ago was eco-efficiency, waste reduction, pollution prevention. These were sort of the early entry points to connect environment to business. And those were very important because prior to that, there was really no positive discussion between environment and business. It was seen as only a cost. It was about regulations, it was about liability, it was about lawsuits and so forth. Thinking about pollution prevention, waste reduction, cost savings made it a relevant business issue where you could actually gain some advantage from it. So that really started the ball rolling. That's where I kind of climbed on. Things ultimately expanded more to thinking about entire product systems, where the raw materials come from, what happens to the products at the end of their useful lives. So that necessarily takes you to the entire supply chain, all the way downstream to customers and what happens to the product when it goes to the landfill and so forth. Now suddenly you have a lot more stakeholders involved. You have to begin to think outside of the box, not just about what goes on inside of the factory gate. And that necessarily opens up a whole new can of worms about what are the big issues the company needs to face up to. And ultimately, that led me to think more in terms of innovation, rather than just thinking about incremental improvements to current products and processes. From a sustainability point of view, how do you get to next generation inherently clean technology that would truly leapfrog us into the future? And it turns out when you begin to focus on that, think about that in a serious way, you discover that since many of these inherently clean technology, renewable energy, point of use water, a lot of other of those kinds of emerging technologies, since they're disruptive, it's very difficult to think about how you bring them into commercialization in the established mainstream market. The more likely place is in underserved markets, in developing countries, off the grid, in rural areas, in urban slums and shanty towns. And that's what ultimately led me to this work on the base of the bottom of the pyramid, where C.K. Prahalad and I first started writing about that in the late 90s. And since then, most of what I've been doing around sustainability has been at that nexus between leapfrog, disruptive, inherently clean technology and serving the underserved.
And I know when I think about this work, there's sort of three pieces that you've done that sort of strike me as being maybe seminal in this space. And I don't know if you want to comment on them. But one of them is the HBR piece that you did, the Beyond Greening, which I think it's that early evolution from beyond just eco-efficiency to innovation and all these other pieces. Then, of course, you and CK did the Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, which really kicked off the whole BOP movement to some degree. And, of course, now in the last year or so, you've got your book, Capitalism at the Crossroads. I don't know if you want to talk about each of those pieces a little bit.
Yeah, I think the Harvard Business Review piece, which is now almost 10 years old, was the first articulation of that transition from just incremental, continuous improvement of the current products and processes, which is what passed for sustainability in the early days. That was kind of the greening agenda. And rather thinking about beyond greening, and beyond greening is the innovation agenda. Beyond greening recognizes that simply incrementally reducing negative impacts when you're growing the economy on a massive scale globally isn't going to get you there, either from society's point of view or from the company's point of view. It doesn't really fully exploit the opportunity space, nor does it make the kind of changes required if you're going to grow the global economy and not destroy the planet at the same time. So the piece in Harvard Business Review, I think, articulated that in a way that made business sense, which is what made it attractive. So I think it was the first time HBR had published a piece like that. And so it set the agenda at some level for thinking about sustainability as innovation. And there was already in that piece, the idea that you have to be thinking about the developing world, that much of this innovation would come from the developing world. But it was really the piece that CK and I began to write then shortly thereafter. We started on it in 1998, specifically focusing on, the poorest 4 or 5 billion people in the world who had been systematically ignored, bypassed, or even damaged by economic globalization. That was where we really focused on that quite explicitly, thinking about it in business terms, which was a fairly revolutionary idea at that point in time. Took us 4 years to get that paper published because no one wanted to touch it back in the late 90s. Ultimately, a new journal, which is kind of always the way it works, I guess, Strategy in Business, was just getting off the ground, became very excited about it post 9/11. It was published in a piece in a special issue of the journal that had to do with security and sustainability. That got it out there, which I think was a very important thing. And for the first time, I think, articulated the idea that those in the base of the pyramid, the economically poorest 4 billion or so, could actually provide business opportunity, represent a business opportunity rather than just be aid recipients. And I think that was a very important message to send. What's happened since then, and I think what my book represents, is a further development of that idea that, at least to some extent, the early thinking on base of the pyramid business could have been and was to some degree interpreted as extractive, that it's just multinationals now looking for more, poor customers to sell products they don't need to. It's the selling to the poor kind of argument. And there's growing pushback about that. And I think it's justified at some level that we be concerned that multinationals simply repackage, or cost reduce current products in smaller sachet packages and then sell stuff to poor people they don't really need. I'm concerned about that, frankly. I don't know that that gets us where we need to go from a sustainable development point of view. So the book is an attempt to try to expand the thinking about BOP and sustainability more broadly, such that we think about base of the pyramid business as a co-creation process. I call it native capability, where what multinationals, the true opportunity isn't just repackaging what you already do and then trying to sell it to poor people. It is forming partnerships and new communities, building new relationships and business ecosystems in the base of the pyramid in such a way that those products are particularly suited, designed, and co-created with local partners, but also builds business ecosystems that create livelihoods, generate income, where you have a combination of production and consumption of products and services that can leapfrog you to the future. So it's the place where you can actually incubate the sustainable technologies of tomorrow. So the book tries to develop that line of thinking around this idea of native capability becoming indigenous, and of course some of that work you and I have done together. So I think that's a really important direction for us to be headed.
I mean, which is, certainly I would support that, of course. Kind of switching gears a little bit, because part of what you've done is you've been a leading thinker, but you've also been an institution builder. And it started here at Michigan to some degree, where you were the founding director of at that time, the Kemp program,
Mm-hmm.
and that sort of evolved. And it'd be interesting to hear kind of how you're thinking in terms of institutions you've developed, and the students that you've taught have changed over the past 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, and to some extent it follows the evolution that I've just described, because the Kemp program here, which started in 1992, I think, was the formal launch of the Kemp program. And just the name of it, right, the Kemp stands for Corporate Environmental Management Program, is suggestive of where thinking was at that point in time. It was kind of a late 80s, early 90s articulation that this was, first of all, is about just environmental management, corporate environmental management, rather than a broader societal context. So I think it's indicative of where the thinking was at that stage of the game, that much of the early impetus behind the Kemp program was eco-efficiency, was pollution prevention, waste reduction, product stewardship. That was the early entry point, and that's what made it relevant in business schools. And so it was a coming together of the School of Natural Resources and Environment and the business school for the first time. And that was fairly revolutionary, you know, for 15 years ago. I think that was a very important development, to bring those two worlds together, and then to have students live in both worlds, which is what the Kemp program was. You know, a joint degree still exists now as the herb program here. But I think what you discover is, if you talk to the current herb students, they have morphed considerably, you know, over the last 15 years into something that's far beyond just that notion. So by the time I left here, went to the University of North Carolina in 1997, 98, had been, because that was the point at which the Harvard Business Review piece came out, you know, my thinking had very much evolved toward the beyond greening agenda. So when I got to UNC, in establishing the Center for Sustainable Enterprise there, much more geared toward the innovation agenda. That's where we started, and you were involved in it, the base of the Pyramid Learning Lab. Of course, you know, you directed it for 2 or 3 years running there. That's where that agenda really got developed, I think, for the first time. Is CK and I were working on the bottom of the pyramid paper that whole time. You know, we started it here, but it took 4 years. It was 2002 before the paper was published, and that was very much a part of what was going on while I was building the center there. Then in the transition from UNC to Cornell in 2003, which is when I went there, the big opportunity there, you know, I would say my perspective has not shifted so much. It wasn't, the transition to a different institution wasn't necessarily content driven so much as being able to leverage the agenda. The fact that you have S.C. Johnson as a major corporate sponsor, that Sam Johnson, you know, the late chairman, CEO of the company, gave the gift both for the chair and for the center, you know, an endowment gift. You have a very supportive university and school, meant that the work could really leverage and grow. That was very appealing, very attractive. And so since that time, since 2003, the base of the Pyramid Learning Lab has expanded and grown. There are now base of the Pyramid Learning Labs, as you know, in various parts of the world at other universities. We've been building that network over the last 3 or 4 years. And there's a new learning lab that we're calling the Sustainable Innovation Learning Lab, which complements the BOP Learning Lab and addresses fundamentally that whole challenge of how do you get incumbent firms into the leapfrog disruptive innovation space, and those two complement each other because you can't really have one without the other.
And I know that now you've sort of moved into this idea of, which I think is very exciting, of the BOP protocol. And, you know, so can you talk a little bit about that and some of the newer things that you're now thinking about or working on?
Yeah, the BOP protocol, for those not familiar with it, grew out of, as you know, the base of the Pyramid Learning Lab. So the wonderful thing about these learning labs, you know, which are really corporate affiliate groups, but it's not just corporations. You also have NGOs and some of the multilaterals and some entrepreneurs and venture capital types. So it's an interesting kind of yeasty admixture of people that come together periodically to meet and to kick around challenges and ideas about how to do this stuff. Out of the BOP Learning Lab came a realization, especially on the part of the multinational people involved, that while it was interesting and important and an opportunity to enter into this base of the pyramid space, multinationals really had very little idea of how to do it. Right? Again, it comes back to this problem of the child and the hammer, you know, that to some degree large multinational corporations behave like a child, the proverbial child with a hammer. They know how to swing the hammer and, you know, do what they currently know how to do, and they're looking for more nails to pound. But the challenge presented by the base of the pyramid is quite different from that. So if you behave like the child with the hammer, eventually you fail. You know, you bump up against some real problems, including some of the pushback that I'm describing. So in weak moments, the multinational members, you know, in the BOP labs, as you remember, would come forward and say, you know, this is really important stuff, but the truth is we don't have a clue about how to do this. And we kind of have this sinking feeling that if we persist trying to apply our existing new product development methodologies and marketing research techniques to this space, that not only are we going to get bad results, but, you know, we could end up with a backlash on our hands because, you know, local people and NGOs are going to perceive it as extractive and imperialistic. We really need help in putting together a whole new approach that would result in a deeper empathetic understanding of what the real needs and aspirations are, and that would be jointly designed rather than imposed, as a technology fix from above. And that was the impetus for the base of the pyramid protocol, which we've now been working on for about 3 years, starting with a design process where we did our due diligence, as you remember, spent about a year kind of with a number of other colleagues, Eric Simonis, Mike Gordon, here at Michigan, WDI has been a partner in that, UNC, the World Resources Institute, a lot of players involved. But we did our due diligence to try to understand what other methodologies, pre-existing methodologies, could be applied. So that led us into the whole participatory suite of techniques like participatory rural appraisal and quick ethnography and in the design field, empathy-based design, and spent time identifying who were the leaders in these fields, who were the practitioners, and then convened a design workshop where we brought those people together, a very diverse group, anthropologists, rural development specialists, NGOs, the Third World Network, Grameen Bank, wide-ranging. Hernando de Soto's group was represented there, as having been involved, and brought this group together to jointly design this new process called the Base of the Pyramid Protocol. That wasn't easy to do. Probably lost a couple of years off my life and trying to play that out. But over about a 4.5-day workshop period, we brought that group together and they coalesced around an approach, which has now been put in the public domain. It's the Base of the Pyramid Protocol. www.bop-protocol.org if you want to go and download the protocol, the first version. We've pilot tested it now. This partner group, along with our corporate sponsors, which were SC Johnson, HP, DuPont, and Tetra Pak. Pilot tested it in Africa with SC Johnson, learned a lot from that, and we're now in the midst of doing a full-scale implementation of it with DuPont in India. And shortly, you'll see a whole lot more coming out about it. So there'll be a version 2.0 of the protocol based on that learning. There's a code of conduct that the group developed, and there'll be a series of writings that'll be coming out about these experiences recently. So it's really beginning to take off in a substantial way.
Have there been any particularly interesting or unexpected findings as you've gone through the process now of implementing the protocol both in Kenya and now in India?
A lot of really important experiences. I don't know if we've been taken by surprise necessarily. There haven't been a lot of unpredictable, counterintuitive. I think to some degree we've confirmed perhaps what some of our suspicions going in were. I'll give one example. That we had the hunch going in because the pilot test that we did with SC Johnson in Kenya was done with an immersion team that didn't include any SC Johnson employees. It was essentially MBA students, including one from Michigan, a couple Cornellians, a couple of former UNC students, so it's that nexus, and then led by Eric Simonis, who is still a doctoral candidate, PhD student. There were no SC Johnson people on the team. So it was outsourced to some degree. That was by design. It was a pilot test. But we kind of had the sneaking suspicion that if there are no SC Johnson people on the team, that could lead to some challenges down the line. And that's proved to be the case, that team becomes very embedded, becomes accepted, becomes known, becomes trusted in the community. And we did both out in the rural areas in Kenya, and an urban slum, the Kibera slum in Kibera. So there's an urban and a rural application. That team becomes known and trusted and part of the community in a sense, and the business ideas are co-created. And when you try to move forward, you're now bringing the company in. Bringing the people in then from the company requires a lot of effort in order for them to achieve the same level of trust. And that's been a challenge. It's slowed the implementation down. It's meant that you have to go through a process of acculturation and bringing new people in. So we learned that if you're going to do this process and do it well, it's really important to have people from the company on the immersion team. We kind of suspected that going in, but it was really confirmed in rolling this out. Plus, having somebody from the technology side as well as the product development side on the team is crucial from our point of view, because that's the only way you're going to be able to bring technological innovation and apply it in new settings and really bring it forward. So we also think it's crucial to build this new capability. The work you and I have done together it's all about capability building. So it's probably tough to outsource that. You know, you would want to have your own people involved so they could acquire this new skill set, which is, I think, crucial to the competitive future of Western multinationals. So S.C. Johnson got around that a little bit. They hired one of the team members.
That's right.
So that's one way to do it. You know, you can outsource and then hire, you know, the team members.
I mean, that very much confirms the idea of just, you know, what co-creation really means, which isn't, co-creation means you have to get involved.
Absolutely. It's tough to outsource.
Yeah.
You really can't outsource it.
I'm sort of, in closing, this is this stream of very, very interesting cutting-edge work. What's next? You know, the protocol's there. You know, is that kind of be the focus of your activities in the near term, or do you have some other things percolating along that you want to discuss?
Yeah. Well, for me, the really interesting challenge going forward is bringing this sustainable innovation idea, and there's the Sustainable Innovation Learning Lab, and the BOP idea more closely together. Because I think there's been a tendency for those ideas to be separated, that, you know, there's a stream of BOP work which often makes no mention of the environment, you know, makes no mention of the underlying sustainability of you know, the proposition, environmental sustainability of the proposition. I think it's critically important that those things be consciously, purposefully integrated, because you really can't have one without the other. And for better or for worse, there are some BOP, as you well know, some BOP initiatives out there that probably have some real environmental problems, you know, that go along with, that accompany them, and that's unsustainable. So I think bringing those two ideas together is critically important. I think also understanding in a clearer way, developing a much clearer perspective about what's the actual on-the-ground sustainable development impact of this kind of work. Again, I think that in the early stages there was a willingness to just say, if we can create a product and sell it, that's okay, you know, that's a success. I think it's crucial to understand in a much deeper way what the ongoing impact is on multiple fronts. You know, what happens in the community, what's the social impact, what's the equity impact, what's the environmental impact, what's the relative acceptance level. To really track this stuff over time is enormously important if it's going to have legitimacy. So for, you know, the companies, getting that work done is a challenge, but I think it's critically important. And in addition, you also have to have the business metrics straight, right? I mean, it better produce growth and profitability as well as having all these other impacts as well. That's consistent with the idea of kind of eliminating trade-off thinking and thinking about win-win.
And I couldn't agree with you more. You know, part of our work here at WDI is actually thinking about what is the impact of BOP enterprise on poverty alleviation, and how do we really begin to understand and measure that? So I couldn't agree more.
Absolutely, and it's poverty alleviation, but I think it's also the big idea of sustainable development, and that includes the environmental piece as well.
And that's part of poverty.
So again, part of the problem, as you well know, that we have is with jargon, right? So people use terminology, and depending on how they're thinking about it, it can be narrower or broader, and that's reflective of a field that's just emerging. But it also makes it difficult sometimes, because if you have a conversation with one person about poverty, they'll have a particular way of thinking, a definition, and it might be quite narrow. It may not include the environment at all, right? Someone else is thinking much more broadly about it. So creating some frame of reference on this where we can have a common conversation, I think, is really important.
I completely agree. Well, Stu, that's all the questions I have, but I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today, and good luck with all your activities. It's been a pleasure knowing you and watching these things happen over the past few years, and I certainly look forward to learning more and seeing more over the coming years.
Thanks, Ted. It's a pleasure to be here.